So we just had two high-level assassinations of cartel leaders in Mexico, threatening to shake up an already volatile situation. Today we're joined by Stefano Rittendale. Stefano is the Chief Intelligence Officer for Artorias and the man behind All Source News. He walks us through these targeted killings, talks about how the cartels have adapted with the recent U.S. focus on locking down the border, and just a gruesome story about cartels trafficking newborn babies that's a little graphic, but I do think it's important to understand who these people are. Now, Stefano is an awesome resource, but I know we're only scratching the surface in these interviews, so if you want more, be sure to check out his work across platforms that all will be linked in the description below. And with that, let's get to the conversation. All right, Stefano, my man, we're looking for a cartel update today. You're always the guy we turn to, so very high level, what are some trends or some things you're seeing in the cartel world over, say, the last 2 to 3 months?
Preston, again, thank you so much for having me. It's always fun to join you guys. What I would say is, one of the key aspects that I think we've seen in kind of the Mexican cartel aspects in the geopolitical, I'll hit on two kind of specific areas. One, actually something that we've seen in this week, which has been kind of shocking, is the amount of key leaders and high leaders of Los Chapitos that have actually not necessarily just been captured, but actually assassinated. So for your viewers, just kind of as a reminder, the Sinaloa cartel obviously is in a civil war. There's two factions, Los Chapitos, which are the sons of El Chapo, and then Mayito Flaco, which is the son of Maya Zambada. They're in an active war, right? Los Chapitos are clearly the ones that are, have been having trouble. They've been losing the civil war. They entered into alliance with the Jalisco New Generation cartel. And the term they kind of use themselves now, the alliance between the Jalisco New Generation cartel and Los Chapitos, is the union, like the Special Forces Union, Fuerzas Especiales Union, right? Special Forces Union. FEU is their acronyms, right? So they had this alliance, and this kind of gave an ability to the Chapitos to continue to fight. The interesting thing in this week specifically, I mean, not even this week, just the last 48 to 72 hours, is that we've seen key leaders of Los Chapitos being assassinated. One of them, his name is El Panu. He had a bounty, I believe, of $4 million by the U.S. government. He was assassinated in Mexico City. Specifically, he was assassinated in an area called Zona Rosa. And for those who don't know, that is like a very upscale neighborhood of Mexico City, right? That used to be where the old U.S. embassy was like across the street from the old embassy. It was a high-end hotel. This is an area frequented by Americans, higher income people, generally really well known for its party life. He was assassinated inside of a hotel. And El Panu, was basically the head of security for Los Chapitos. And so the fact that he got assassinated in Mexico City was pretty shocking. Like, that is a huge development. And then from there, we saw another key leader of Los Chapitos assassinated in Culiacan, Sinaloa, right? And that person who was assassinated, he had a $1 million bounty on his head by the U.S. government. And then also, so that was yesterday, the other assassination. And also yesterday, two basically family members of Ivan El Chivaldo, the leader of Los Chapitos, were captured. Don Mario, the alias, and then 07, or the 7. Right? So in the period of 72 hours, we have two assassinations and then two captures within the leaders of Los Chapitos. And the question is obviously, okay, well, there's not that many figures left within Los Chapitos, right? Because they've hit this year as an overall year of 2025, Los Chapitos have been losing key leaders mostly by the hands of the Mexican government, right? El Panu, for example, the one assassinated in Mexico City, he took over after his predecessor, the head of security of Los Chapitos, called El Perris, right? El Perris was killed by Mexican special forces in Sinaloa, right? He was preceded by El Nini and then El Güero. And so you see all these figures getting captured by the Mexican government. And now this week, though, assassinations. So the question we have is, well, who did this assassination, right? We don't necessarily have definitive proof, but I think more than likely it was the rivals of Los Chapitos, the Mayito Flacos, who are doing this. And the fact that we've had two assassinations, one in Mexico City and one in Culiacan, indicates that Mayito Flaco either has a mole and very good access of information inside of Los Chapitos, or maybe other ulterior motives. We could put our conspiracy hats on and see, is he receiving help from the Mexican government, which is pretty, we probably suspect that he does. Are Los Chapitos themselves trying to hand out information because they're trying to enter into negotiation with Mexican governments or with the Mayito Flacos, so they're trying to remove rivals? Are Los Chapitos concerned that El PANU might have switched sides? Because that's always been a concern. We've seen Los Chapitos lose members. There's a lot of information we don't know, but at the end of the day, one of the interesting aspects online here is that the Jalisco New Generation Cartel is going to have to pick up more and more roles within Los Chapitos to ensure that the Chapitos can continue to operate, because the Chapitos just don't have any more key leaders to do it. And so is this kind of a long-term thing that the Jalisco New Generation Cartel is just going to more and more absorb Los Chapitos? And I think that's what's looking like very likely. And again, another conspiracy, it might even be maybe Jalisco New Generation is doing this, right? Because they just want to take everybody in Los Chapitos and remove them as an independent cartel.
Well, I'll stick with my conspiracy hat here for a second. You mentioned 2 senior officials that have American bounties on their heads, so they're clearly on our radar. Is there the possibility of American involvement?
I mean, anything is possible, right? I mean, but that's the thing. I mean,
no evidence. I guess we should probably leave with that, right?
That's the thing. But would I be surprised? No. I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, can you make the argument for that? Like, why would this be in the benefit of the United States per se?
I mean, well, because if again I go back to the issue, if you're looking at Los Chapitos, right? I mean, if you want a poster child of the fentanyl crisis in the United States, it's Los Chapitos, specifically Iván Archibaldo. Right. I mean, everybody pushes fentanyl in Mexico, right? Let's make this abundantly clear in the Mexican side, right? Unlike, when people talk about Venezuela, like Venezuela's not a pusher of fentanyl. It's the Mexican cartels are the ones through the connections with China, right? And it's actually very interesting when you look at organizational charts within cartel, you generally see this, a Chinese figure very well connected sending the precursors into Mexico. There was actually one recently extradited to the United States. His alias was Brother Wang. Brother Wang was a key chemical precursor guy from China who dealt with both the Sinaloa cartel, both factions, and the Jalisco New Generation cartel. Like, the interesting aspect, these are kind of one of the, how the Chinese operate. Like, he did business with both cartels, and neither cartel touched him. They're just like, oh, that's fine. We just want our precursors to make fentanyl and ship it over to the United States, right? Brother Wang is now in U.S. He was extradited to the U.S. But if you look, even though all the cartels are involved in fentanyl, the key one is Los Chapitos. And so from the U.S. perspective, I mean, yeah, they would, if they wanted to do it, I mean, these guys had bounties in their heads for drug trafficking and other nefarious activities. I mean, there could be a scenario where that happens. I just, these were clearly like hits, like from the mafia, right? Would the U.S. do it that way? I mean, look, I'm not a CIA guy, maybe, possibly. But that's why there's no evidence for it. But it doesn't hurt America. And we've talked about this, kind of the difference between the U.S. and Mexico, how they view things. And from the U.S. perspective, anything that can weaken a cartel at the end of the day is beneficial. And that's the thing that we're seeing with Los Chapitos, is that they have been severely, severely weakened.
Does the Jalisco New Generation coming in to take over those positions, is that something the U.S. would view? Again, we're talking about like bad actors here,
yeah.
Right? To be clear, like if they were all gone, that would be great. But I'm trying to think in the realm of how the U.S. has kind of interacted around the world throughout our lifetimes. Is we tend to choose like the less bad or the little more malleable, a little more favorable. Is that something to consider here?
I mean, that would be the downside. I think that would be very bad for the Americans, Jalisco New Generation cartel to go. But there's nothing. But it's not like the United States can prevent that, right? And I think that's something that our listeners has to understand, right? The Mexicans cartels operate within the Mexican cartel world, like, and there's nothing really that the U.S. can do to influence it. There's nothing that the Trump administration or Biden can do to kind of maybe one way or another influence, right? One of the draw signs that we're seeing is because of this alliance, the Jalisco New Generation cartel clearly is going to gain the most from this. Right, and I think they're one of the key winners of it. And I think that's going to be the key problem set for 2026. Again, I mean, the interesting aspect is when you're looking at cartels, let's take a step back and analyze cartels internationally in the sense of outside of the Mexican dynamic. Because in your episode, we talk a lot about the aspect of cartels inside of Mexico. But if you zoom out and you see how they operate outside of Mexico, they operate a little bit differently. So, for example, the Sinaloa cartel civil war, right, for the most part, has not impacted the Sinaloa cartel's presence internationally, in the sense that there was a great report from CNN, and I was talking to the reporter, Avery, He's the OSINT reporter for CNN. Him and I talk regularly about cartels, and he did a great analysis and reporting on it. And what I found out that in the United States, based on his reporting, again, for the most part, the Sinaloa cartel operatives that he interviewed, they said, hey, that civil war, that's a thing in Mexico. Like, it does not impact how we operate. We're still the Sinaloa cartel, right? Very interesting dynamic, right? In other words, the civil war is confined to Mexico. We haven't seen it spread out internationally. We haven't seen assassinations inside the United States related to it necessarily. We haven't seen it in Europe or anywhere else. And the business model is still functioning, even though there's a civil war inside. I've talked to another a cartel expert. Her name is Hurst on X. She has started to notice some of that split occurring in Los Angeles, but from the grand scheme of things internationally, not really. The Sinaloa cartel still operates as a unitary cartel outside of Mexico, right? But when we're looking at it from the Jalisco New Generation cartel, they're clearly the biggest cartel internationally. So if you run into a situation where the Jalisco New Generation cartel inside of Mexico absorbs Los Chapitos inside of Mexico, then the question becomes what happens outside of Mexico? Do certain elements of the Sinaloa cartel, specifically those that are more aligned with Los Chapitos, break off internationally and go with the Jalisco New Generation cartel? Or do they still operate within the construct of the Sinaloa cartel? They're just now part of Mayito Flaco. That's the biggest unknown. And sometimes you're going to have to analyze it by countries, because in some countries we've seen both cartels operate to get where they don't mess with each other, i.e. Colombia. Jalisco New Generation cartel and Sinaloa cartel operations in Colombia, they don't necessarily fight against each other because that's where all the cocaine comes from. They just want to buy the cocaine. They're like, hey, we're not going to mess with each other. For the most part, there are some instances of violence within their, proxy groups that fight each other, but they're not. Ecuador is different. Los Choneros y los Lobos, the Sinaloa cartel support Los Choneros, Jalisco New Generation cartel supports Los Lobos. Los Choneros and Lobos are foreign terrorist organizations by the Trump administration. There's kind of like a proxy war that they leverage in Ecuador, because Ecuador is where all the cocaine gets sent over to the U.S. So again, you would have to analyze by country, but for the most part, the violence inside of Mexico, we haven't necessarily seen it spread out of Mexico. The question, though, becomes if those Chapitos go away, and the way you would need to look at that is really if Ivan Archibaldo falls, the leader of Los Chapitos. If he falls, if he's captured or killed, they're done. I mean, there's no organization left. It would have to be the Jalisco New Generation cartel. Once that happens, then it would be interesting to come back, Preston, and see, okay, what did we see internationally? Did this have an impact at all? Because right now, we're not really seeing a major impact internationally.
I want to shift over to the operations a bit. Something that's stuck with me from either our first or second conversation. I was trying to draw a comparison between terrorist groups, Islamic State and Al-Qaeda and the cartels, and you said you just drove home. I don't remember exactly how you put it, but essentially it's a business, and they are doing things for profit motives. They're trying to make money. So I do want to come back to the baby trafficking incident you mentioned just before we got started. I intentionally don't want to lead with that because it feels a little clickbaity and just awful. But I think it's worth mentioning that to kind of show folks who we're talking about here. But first, with the business operations piece of things, a lot of stats out of the United States in the last few months have shown that drug seizures along the border have been down and illegal crossings have been down. I have a whole other question about how do we count that to begin with? But if that's the case, what are you seeing from the cartels in terms of shifting operations to maintain that profit margin?
Right. So I think when we're looking at the drug seizures, right, I think what we're seeing is, I think the drug seizures, it might be interesting. If we're looking at cocaine, I can tell you right now, there's a cocaine bonanza of just mass cocaine. I mean, cocaine is being flooded to the United States and Europe. It is just an insane amount of cocaine. And what we're seeing,
over what period? Compared to a few months ago, compared to 10 years ago, or
2024, we saw record seizures of cocaine. 2025 blew past that.
Okay, so it's on the rise.
Yeah. I mean, and the Wall Street Journal had a really good article laying this out. And what they laid out was how the Jalisco New Generation cartel is leveraging cocaine to have a dominance in the U.S. drug market, right? To the point that even there was so much cocaine in the United States, and this was an article I think reported about a month or 2 months ago, that price of cocaine inside the United States was going down.
That's
right?
crazy.
Because we're seeing, I think, the fentanyl piece, and I think we talked about that because of the drop, how fentanyl has dropped. Cocaine is the next area, right? And it kind of goes back to this conversation that I think we're having when we're talking about Venezuela. So I'm gonna answer all your points, and I'm gonna try to make
Yeah.
it
Listen, man, I just love that affordability is such a big issue right now. And it seems like the only thing coming down is cocaine. That's great. USA.
Hey man, you gotta pick your wins, right? So let's look at it from the cocaine piece, right, and drugs. So that's one area, right, the drugs. So when we're analyzing drugs, specific cocaine, where I do think we're seeing a huge amount of seizures is actually in the maritime area, and we've already seen that. We've seen that in 2024, and we're seeing it in 2025, and now the Trump administration obviously doing their strikes against these vessels, right? Okay.
But not just to clarify, though, it's not just the strikes. Like there's a number of seizures being reported as well, right? Like massive
Panama, I think in the beginning of December, if memory serves me correctly, seized 12 tons of cocaine from a vessel. I mean, 12 tons of cocaine. Yeah. Panama. Like, look at the Colombian. Dude, here's the funny thing. You know, our app SitRep, right, that has the Colombia feed. Like, there's a point where I'm checking Colombia and I'm like, is this circular reporting? Or is this like new information? It's new because the amount of times that the Colombian authorities announce seizures of tons of cocaine in Colombia is astronomical. We've seen that in Mexico. We see that across the Western Hemisphere. The French Navy has been punching way above their weight in this terms of seizing cocaine internationally. I mean, the French Navy has been going on a roll in seizing cocaine. And recently the US, the Dutch, and the French signed an agreement to extend their international cooperation in drug, to disrupt drug trafficking in the Western Hemisphere, right? And so that's where I think we're seeing, and maybe that's why we're not necessarily seeing as much. I would have to kind of track the cocaine seizures across the U.S.-Mexico border, but we are seeing a lot of it inside the Western Hemisphere and the maritime route specifically. And I think that goes to the point. The Jalisco Generation Cartel has really leveraged a lot of the cocaine to push it. Now, for your listeners to understand, Colombia is where the cocaine is manufactured for the most part. And then you have Bolivia and Peru, right? But the majority of it is in Colombia. And then the question is, all these groups, how do they buy it? To the business model aspect, right? That's where Venezuela is a key role, right? Not only Colombia, but Venezuela. So for the longest time, there's a province in Venezuela, I think it's called Zulia, Venezuela, right? It's in the western part that borders Colombia. And for the longest time, it was considered like a mini Sinaloa. Like if you would go to this border area of Venezuela and Colombia, it was like if you were in Sinaloa, you had Mexican food, Sinaloa music, you had Mexican banda, because the Sinaloa cartel managed to really establish themselves their presence in this area because the goal was to buy cocaine from the Colombians, either FARC, ELN, Clan del Golfo, these auto defense groups, whoever's manufacturing the cocaine, purchase it from Colombia and then ship it over to the United States, right? Or even to Europe. Recently, it looks like the Venezuelan military went into Zulia, Venezuela, and kicked the Sinaloa cartel out of there. But not because they're, very hardcore anti-cartel. No, they just wanted to do the cocaine business themselves. They realized the Sinaloa cartel was taking away their profit margins. They went in, kicked out the Sinaloa cartel, and established themselves in because they wanted the money. And that's the interesting aspect. Like if you analyze the Venezuelan Cartel de los Soles, in many aspects, they're kind of like a competitor to the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel because they don't manufacture the drugs. They just traffic it. And they send it to anywhere around the world. That's why I have a huge problem when people make the argument because of Venezuela. They said, well, only about 8% of cocaine that gets to the U.S. is shipped from Venezuela. They can track it from Venezuela, right? They use that as saying, oh, but the problem is Mexico. Well, one, if we're going to use that logic, then the problem is Colombia because 90% of drugs come from Colombia,
sure.
right? But that's not how this works, right? The Venezuelan military, just like the Sinaloa cartel, just like the Jalisco New Generation cartel, they're the export-import. They're the managerial logistical component of it. They're the ones that plan to get the drugs from the destination, let's say Colombia, Bolivia, Peru, to their end destination, generally the United States or Europe or maybe some markets in Asia, right? They manage that. Like, so the Venezuelan military, for example, protects ELN. ELN owns the drugs. But just because a drug route, the vast majority of drugs that reach the United States takes the Pacific route, so the Colombian Pacific coast or the Ecuador route, to then go back and say, well, it can't be Venezuela because it didn't originate from Venezuela. Like, that's not how this works, Because that's like, you can have a drug get straight from Ecuador, straight on the maritime route to the United States. Does that mean it's not the Mexican cartels? Of course it is, because they're doing the managerial aspect. It's the same with the Venezuelans. You cannot analyze them as where the drug originated from a trafficking perspective to say that they're the culprit. That's a false way of analyzing, and I think the media continues to fall into that. And
is it our trying to put kind of nation state barriers on something or parameters around something that is done by transnational groups, if that makes sense?
I think it's a lack of understanding of the business model. And I think that's also a very interesting way of analyzing it, right? Like, how do they do that? And because, again, the Venezuelan military, the Cartel de los Soles, there's many ways they operate. Like, they also operate in the sense that they can enable other cartels to operate freely in their area. Like, for example, in Zulia, Venezuela, for the longest time, the Sinaloa cartel was able to operate freely until the Venezuelan military decided to kick them out because they wanted the profit margins for themselves, right? So if it's not the Sinaloa cartel, because then they had to go to Colombia, but now at that province, the drugs are still going through in and out, but now it's not the Sinaloa cartel. Here comes the Venezuelan military and takes it. But they can coordinate it in a sense that necessarily doesn't go through Venezuela. I mean, it's almost like if you're buying oil. Like, if any of your listeners is like buys and trades commodities, the buyers of the commodities in the stock market are the cartels. That's how they are. And I wouldn't even be surprised if there's like a stock market, and they just all on the phone, like, oh, I'll pay you this, I'll pay you this. Well, this is where the market says, this is what the prices are. Because all this is tracked. Literally, that's how they're doing. If you have an Econ 101, if you've done stock markets, if you're a day trader, just switch oil or any commodity and put drugs. And more than likely, you're closer to how the drug trade works than most other analysts would believe it does. That's the drug piece. Here's another piece of the business model that I think is important for your listeners to know. And we've seen the Trump administration really focus their sanctions on this aspect, and it's oil. If you look at the Biden administration, if you look at their sanctions, they were very much targeted against Los Chapitos mostly, but other cartels, because the reason why they were doing it was because of the fentanyl trade, right? So the Biden administration's focus was fentanyl. We're starting to see a trend within the Trump administration where they're focusing their sanctions, and that's in the Mexican oil market. And the reason why is because Mexican cartels are heavily involved in illegal oil sales. We have seen multiple sanctions now by the U.S. Treasury Department targeting the oil sector in Mexico, because specifically how cartels are enabled. One of the estimates we got in another one, Jalisco New Generation Cartel, they were making about $20 billion a year in illegally selling oil to the United States. Not just like specifically to the U.S. And if you read the kind of the sanctions and the reporting, Preston, it kind of reads like the shadow fleets of the Russians. Like, we're talking about like vessels, oil tankers that are fronts that are doing everything illegally in coordinations with the Mexican government. Specifically, there's a huge scandal that the Mexican Navy and leadership within the Mexican Navy is in cahoots with a lot of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel and other cartels for selling this oil to the United States. And again, these are being sold to American oil companies, and a lot of them have been indicted by the Trump administration. There have been indictments in Texas against them to sell oil to the United States. So we've seen the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. The recent sanction list was a very violent local cartel called the Santa Rosa de Lima Cartel. They have an alliance with the Maito Flacos and Scorpion Group. They are in a very violent conflict against the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, and they're based out of Guanajuato. Very, very violent. But most of their business model is not drugs, it's oil, because a lot of the oil pipelines are in Guanajuato, and they just tap into it and sell it. That and extortion. Yes. Right? Yeah. And we're also seeing cartels do that in the oil side. And we're seeing the Trump administration really focus on the oil sector, because that's the clearest area where not only do we see cartels make a lot of money, but they have that connection with corrupt Mexican officials. That's where we're seeing the Trump administration really focus. The last area is what you're saying, the human smuggling, and specifically the babies, right? So what happened, right? What are we seeing in Mexico? And I've laid this out. So when the Trump administration came in and they kind of shut down the border, what we saw was during the Biden administration, the amount of human smuggling networks that rose up exploded. I mean, an enormous amount just sprung up because there was such an easy way to make money. Send people across the United States. It was a quantity. We don't give a shit. Just give us the money. We'll send it, right? A lot of organizations stood up to try to make money that way. When the Trump administration came in and kind of shut that down, what we saw was the organizations that have been doing this for a long time, and some of them even connected to specific cartels, like the Northeast cartel out of Nuevo Laredo, borders Laredo, Texas. They were able to adapt, and so we generally seen them adapt through utilizing drones to really evade border patrol. We've seen them leverage tunnels. There's still a lot of these human smugglers that operate that they know how to evade, and there might be an aspect of corruption as well, and using corruption against U.S. Customs and Border Patrol agents to try to get these guys through, right? But it's now more of a quality aspect. But a lot of these groups that formed weren't able to adapt. And so what we saw was, because they weren't making revenue by human smuggling, what we saw is extortion and kidnapping skyrocket along northern Mexico, targeting Mexicans. But there was one specific group, which is the baby smuggling aspect that I think is important to know, that did things a little bit differently. And her name is La Diabla, right? She was a well-known member of La Línea, or the Juarez cartel, who's also very well connected with the Jalisco New Generation cartel, because La Línea and the Jalisco New Generation cartel have an alliance. And because they were no longer making money smuggling people across the border, what they did was a different model approach, because they saw a demand in the U.S. and they did this. What they were doing is they were targeting late term pregnancy women in like their third trimester, right? They would target them, trick them into thinking, oh, this is an employment opportunity, etc. And what they would do is rudimentary C-sections to extract the baby and kill the mother, and then even sell the organs of the mothers, and then traffic the babies into the United States through like basically a fake adoption process. Right, it was just a fake adoption. And the Office of Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, in one of the cabinet meetings or briefings she had with President Trump, this was one of the cases they laid out. And it does look like the National Counterterrorism Center, the director, Joe Kent, he made a press statement about this, really highlighting this role. I helped a key reporter, Katarina Schultz, break the story. And again, what this story shows is, again, this happened during the second Trump administration, right? It started and ended, and it didn't last long, because by the time the Mexican, specifically the Chihuahua State Police, found out about this case, because they saw a body, and literally the pictures haven't been published, but I've been told it's atrocious. It's basically the woman's just completely, like, her stomach's open, right? They find this woman like that, stomach open, no organs, no babies. They're clearly thinking, something is going on. We need to shut this down quick. And this is one of the areas where the Chihuahua State Police went, to extraordinary lengths to shut this operation down. So it was a very quick operation. But it highlights, to your point, that since some of these organizations weren't able to adapt to this new model, and specifically La Nina, CDN, and Gulf Cartel as their border cartels, they don't make their own products. They need products pushed to them to sell that. That's why they have alliances with other groups, because they receive their drugs from other groups, or they receive human smuggling from other groups. That's how they make money, because they control the plaza and they can charge a fee. Because they weren't able to make up for the lost income in the human smuggling into the United States and migration, this specific cell, instead of, they would target Mexicans just like the others, but in a very brute fashion, and they found a demand in the U.S. for adoptions, and that's the route they take. But luckily, it was shut down pretty quick. I know it was a long overview, but I think hopefully it answered your key questions.
That was awesome, man. I just want to say how dark and how crazy it is that we talk about adapting to a new market, and that quickly turns into people cutting babies out of pregnant women. Like, that's insane, insanely dark. Holy cow.
And if we talked about this offline, I'll just say it here. There's an article that's going to be published because they did more reporting on this for a major news organization. And I think the quote basically said, because one of the reporters was, because this was very publicized by the Trump administration, all that, and there was kind of this aspect, the question, well, how do you think, how's the Trump administration going to leverage this? Is there a concern they're going to use this as an excuse for much more extensive operations against cartel? And I kind of had to stop. And kind of like, are we really, out of the entire story, as I to your point, that's what we're concerned about? That's what we're concerned about. Because if that's the case, cartels have won. I already think they've won in the sense that they've already normalized violence to the point where we have a woman whose baby was ripped out of her, murdered. The the pregnant woman's mother, so the child's grandmother, has been fighting tooth and nail to find her grandson. And our concern is, how is this going to be leveraged in American politics? Even in the Mexican side, you see them say, oh, well, maybe she was involved or she did this. Well, clearly, what are we talking about?
To be fair, I feel like our domestic political discourse has been poisoned for a while now. How many times it's disgusting to see it in this sense, no doubt. But isn't that kind of like, I feel like a part of you wasn't surprised when you heard that, right? Like, wasn't completely shocked that people were looking for a domestic angle,
right? But you see this also in the U.S. and the Mexico, but that's the conversation. And it's like
that's the problem, man. We're on the same page here, yeah.
Cartels have won. They have won. They won. They can hang bodies up in a bridge. Nobody gives a shit. They can extract babies from a pregnant lady. Nobody gives a shit. That's the headline. Make that your title. Literally, what else do cartels need to do in the extreme levels of violence for people to just for 1 second say, holy goddamn shit? This is outrageous. I'm not saying carpet bomb them, napalm them, or like domestic terrorists or foreign terrorists. Just like for once, can there just be a 1 second, just be like, hey, we should do something? Because in Mexico, we saw mass protests because of an assassination of a mayor in Michoacan, in Uruapan, right? But the protest, rightfully so, and I understand it, was tied to because of the government corruption, because this guy kind of had this mantle of like anti-corruption. He was assassinated, right? Great. But what blows my mind is no Mexican outrage is going to happen, clearly, because of violence inside of Mexico. And clearly in the United States, everything just gets contaminated to no end because of domestic politics. And we can't just focus on the clear story of just extreme level of brutality that in the United States we would never tolerate. But now we have. And at that point, the only thing I can say is the goal of the cartels to normalize violence, to do whatever the hell they want. They have achieved it. Mission accomplished. And if somebody asks me, how are we going to fix this? Well, until we fix the normalization of violence, we're not going to be able to fix it.
Contamination of the information space is a really good way to put that. Look, man, I get in trouble on the home front because I'll get our daughter all riled up and like bouncing off the walls, and then I'll step away to go do something else, make my wife deal with it. I'm going to do the same thing here. We got Stefano ripping off the top rail, and leave that for your family to absorb here in the next couple hours. Dude, really appreciate you walking through all this. It's like drinking from a fire hose every single time. So everybody, please go follow Stefano and Arturius and his work everywhere else, because I'm sure you listen to this and want more details. It's out there. Stefano's putting it out. Be sure to check out his work. But thank you again so much, man.
Thank you, Preston. It's always great to have on. And maybe, I can't promise you, but more than likely the next time I'm on, I'll be passionate as always.
I love it. That's what we're here for. We'll see you, man.
Thanks.
So thank you so much to Stefano for taking the time, especially during this busy holiday season. And I know I said it at the beginning, but every time we talk with Stefano, I feel like I can tell that we are just scratching the surface, and he clearly can just talk about this stuff for hours and hours and hours and hours. So I imagine there's plenty of you that just got a little snippet of what you wanted to hear. Be sure to check out Stefano's work. He is focused on this, hyper-focused on this, day in and day out, genuinely is an expert in the space. All of his information will be in the description below. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.